Today we're going to look at the idea of almsgiving, and before I start this, what I'd like to do is look a little bit at the Jewish structure of almsgiving, because in the teaching of Scripture, it is within that structure. So the first thing to know about the Jewish concept of almsgiving has to do with the tithe. Every Jewish person was required to tithe. And if what you dealt in was money, like a banker or something, you would tithe money. If what you dealt in was sheep or produce, you would tithe animals or produce, whatever it was. And the tithe in Israel all went to one thing. The entire tithe was to the care of the poor. That's exactly where it went to. Now, most people who look at this today within the Catholic community say that most Catholics in the thing of tithe, you actually do that with regards to your taxes, because your taxes cover things like Social Security and social welfare and that sort of thing. So probably the Jewish concept of tithe is actually fulfilled by your taxes. The second thing that the Jews did was each person in the entire country was taxed 1/2 shekel a year, and that would go to the support of the temple. And if you were a very wealthy person, you were never allowed to contribute more to the temple than 1/2 shekel. It couldn't be done. And if you basically had nothing, you'd be wise to scrape up a 1/2 shekel. But the 1/2 shekel was basically for the support of the temple itself. And the reason why they wouldn't allow anyone to give more was they wanted no one to come into the temple more entitled to the temple than someone else. So if King Herod walked into the temple beside someone who sold pencils on the corner, the temple belonged equally to each of them. They had each made their 1/2 shekel. The third area of offering has to do with the idea of particular sacrifices. There was a sacrifice when you had a child. There was a sacrifice for purification, basically forgiveness of sins. There were a whole series of sacrifices that we read about occasionally in the Scriptures. And they're the third element of giving. And once those three are met, that's when you start almsgiving. Like, none of those three are considered almsgiving. In the Jewish tradition, those three things were required. Okay? Now, once that's done, then we enter into almsgiving. So the first thing I want you to notice about almsgiving, the way it's covered in the Bible, almsgiving in the Bible is a voluntary practice. Your responsibility has been met. That's done. So now we're talking about almsgiving as a voluntary gift. And in the Jewish tradition, and we see some of this in some of the early writings, but to understand, almsgiving is not for the benefit of whatever you give alms to. Almsgiving is for the benefit of the almsgiver, and that's how it's seen in Scripture. Now, the tithe, obviously, is for the benefit of the poor. The 1/2 shekel is obviously for the benefit of the temple structure. But almsgiving is for the benefit of the one who gives alms. And I guess the two examples I would use that probably everyone in this room is familiar with. The first one I'll take is cooking. My mother, when she was a little tiny girl, they had an accident in her home. And the accident that occurred in her home is her youngest brother pulled a pot of boiling milk off the stove onto him. Now, fortunately, he had minor scars and lived through the whole thing. But the one who was most traumatized by it was my grandmother. And as a result of that, no children were ever allowed in the kitchen. So when my mother, was an adult, she had to learn to cook. She hadn't been taught at all. So one of her first resolutions was that the children should learn to cook. And as we would go through, sometimes my sister would help her, sometimes I would help her, and everyone who's ever been a mother here and ever helped by a child prepare a meal, it would be a lot easier if the kid were locked outside the house when you prepared the meal. You don't have a kid help you because it makes it easier. That is not the issue. You have a child help you because you want to teach the child responsibility or teach them to cook or something like this. But if you have a child help you prepare a dinner, it is not for your benefit. So it's the same type of thing. And I take the thing with regards to my father. My father was involved in all sort of minor repairs in the house. All of you know there's always something to be done with regards to a house. So my father would be involved in any kind of electrical work where the danger of electrocution wasn't. And he'd be involved in any kind of plumbing work that didn't involve the creation of a geyser. And of course, then my sister and I would help him with all that stuff too. And again, I'm sure it would have been easier, quicker, and safer if my sister and I had been locked out of the house while we did it. But they did it basically for the benefit of us. I should mention one thing about the cooking. I did not realize the tremendous benefit of my mother showing me something about cooking until I was stationed with Monsignor Early. I don't know how many of you know Monsignor Early, but Monsignor Early, being raised, knew how to do one thing. And I think he was probably never taught. In Ireland, it's probably just part of your psyche. He knew how to make tea. That was it, okay? And whenever we would have a housekeeper was sick or wasn't present, if you came in during a meal, you'd find Monsignor Early in the kitchen with a hot cup of tea, eating peanut butter in a spoon, with a spoon out of a jar, because he knew how to make nothing. So while we were there, if we would run into him at a meal, we'd either take him out or make him something. But the fact of the matter is he knew, nothing about that. I don't know where that came from. Thank God peanut butter is as nourishing as it is, or he'd have been dead long before he was. So this is first of all for the benefit of the alms giver. And I'd like to go through, first of all, one of the major benefits. Probably the person from whom I heard about this, and isn't from a personal relationship because I never knew him personally, was Schuller. But one of the things that Schuller used to talk about, and he's the guy who started the Crystal Cathedral. But anyway, when Schuller was a little boy, he and his family were extremely poor. And so when Schuller would go to school, he always had old clothes that were patched. Both he and his sister, I forget how many children they had, but I remember him talking about his sister. And they would go to school with clothes patched, and people would kid them about it because of the types of things in their lunch and this sort of thing. And he and his sister never understood what was going on. And they never in their life felt poor. And one of the reasons was, when they would go to church on Sunday, their father would give each of them a nickel to put in the collection. And Schuller said, we would always think, if we were poor, we couldn't give money to anybody. But if we are able to give money, then obviously, we have extra, so we can't be that poor. And one of the things about generosity, it creates a sense of abundance in the person who gives. It's an amazing quality. And someone who is not involved in any kind of almsgiving or giving will be immune to this sort of sense of abundance. And I'm sure all of us here know people who are relatively poor, who have no sense of being poor. And all of us here know people who are insanely rich, who are not really sure they'll make it through tomorrow. And it is an attitude. It is flat out an attitude. And that attitude of generosity, of abundance rather, or of poverty, that attitude comes largely from the ability to share what we have with other people. Another thing is to understand about the Pauline concept of giving. When we talk about almsgiving, probably the major person dealing with this is Paul. And Paul, as you know, took a huge collection. There was a great famine in Jerusalem. And when this famine occurred in Jerusalem, Paul had been watching through his life the great difficulty of Jews and Gentiles and Jews who were all Christians, the great difficulty of trying to meld this community together. And the first major step he made was making Timothy one of the leaders in the early church. Timothy's mother was Jewish, so all the Jews considered him Jewish, and his father was a Gentile, so all the Gentiles considered him a Gentile. So he became one of the ones who was able to begin to pull the community together. But the second thing he did was a collection, and he made it very, very clear that the Gentile community received the faith from the Jews. but he wanted that the Gentile community should be able to make this donation during this terrible famine, so the Jews would feel that they had received something in return from the Gentiles, and it would draw the community together. And there was quite a bit of success with regards to that. But anyway, as he began this collection, you have to understand, he's thinking simply in terms of alms. And having said that now, to look at some of the stuff. One of the major things of Paul is that you must be happy in giving, okay? The Lord loves a cheerful giver. And Paul, incidentally, quotes that from Jesus, although I think he has in his writings 3 quotes from Jesus that we can't find anywhere in the gospel account. So they must be somewhere in tradition, but we've never found them. But he says, the Lord loves a cheerful giver. And when I've ever heard this mentioned in homilies, the general thing was the pastor was telling us we needed to be more cheerful. Okay? But I think basically what Paul is getting at is you need to stop giving beyond a point where you enjoy it. So like for instance, the way to be sure you're a cheerful giver is not to give beyond a certain point. And just to give you an example, when I was going for physical therapy on my shoulder, one of the things, I'm really a curious person. So one of the things I asked the therapist, I said, does my body get better benefit out of, so many repetitions with the weight through, let's say, 5 minutes? Or would I get better benefit if I just held it as high as I could for 5 minutes? And he said, you get 5 times the benefit if you can just hold it up. So one of the things I did with the weights, I didn't go through the exercises. I would hold it until it started to hurt and then lower it to where it didn't hurt. And then I could hold it there practically forever. And I went through the therapy in about a quarter of the time of the other people who were going through that same therapy. And I feel that with regards to the idea of almsgiving. If you can keep your almsgiving in the area where you enjoy it and get something out of it, the chances of you giving more and being more involved in almsgiving become very, very high. And remember, if it's a matter of alms being for the benefit of who you're giving to, then the idea is to give the maximum amount. But if the benefit of almsgiving is to you, the key is to enjoy it, okay? It's no benefit to you if you don't really enjoy it. So the first thing is to be very careful about this. Paul says that one of the major things to avoid is impoverishing yourself. In the idea of almsgiving, you want to give in a way that does not somehow impoverish you. And to understand this notion of impoverishing is a very complicated thing, particularly with regards to parents. That you would have no right to jeopardize the education of your children in favor of a donation. No right to jeopardize, things like that. To understand, don't impoverish yourself, that it shouldn't really erode the life you're about. The other thing is how to give. And how to give, again, I think really applies to individuals. One of the major ways to give is organizations. And what you do is find organizations or about things you're interested in. If we were to look at our area, we could take, if you're interested in helping the poor, certainly in the church, there's the Vincent de Paul and something like Dorothy's Kitchen. But you could also find that in the Red Cross and in the Salvation Army. Both of them are involved in giving and taking care of groups. I will tell you one thing to know about organizations. There is a website on the computer, and I have no idea exactly where it is, but I'm sure you can find it by looking, that will tell you the percentage of what you give to any organization actually goes to what it's supposed to be doing. And if you go on that website, one of the horrifying things is that there are nonprofit organizations where less than 20% of what you give will ever end up there. And so I think you need to have a caution about that sort of thing. Another thing, like with regards to organizations, and I mentioned this during the thing in Haiti, when the disaster occurred in Haiti or the disaster in Japan, if you want to successfully donate money to those, you should donate it through a religious organization. You could donate it through the Catholics or the Baptists or whatever these. And the reason is a religious organization already has in place a distribution system. So like, for instance, if I were to decide that we really needed to help Haiti, and I were to form an organization here to collect money for Haiti, we would have to collect money for Haiti and money to send people over and support them to distribute the money that we did send to Haiti. Whereas if you give it to like the Baptists, they're Baptist churches in Haiti. If you give it to the Catholics, they're Catholic churches in Haiti. You give it whatever. But sometimes, particularly in the area of disasters, through religious groups, I think is always kind of the best. But something really to be aware of. The second thing in donating to organizations to be conscious of, do you remember the one time Jesus was saying that if you ever give a cup of water to a prophet, because he's a prophet, you get the prophet's reward? And he goes through several of these things. Well, to understand, when you support an organization, you participate in what that organization is about. So if you decide to participate in an organization, you better find out what they're about, because you share in a responsibility. And just to give you one bad example, there was an organization formed in Israel by the Jewish people who were very, very concerned about what was happening to the Palestinians. And that organization actually functioned in the United States as well as in Israel. And it collected money to help those Palestinians whose homes had been destroyed by the air raids and everything involved in the Jewish-Palestinian war. They ultimately discovered that the bulk of that money went to Al-Qaeda. And so you just really need to be aware of what you're about. The reason why I mention this, if you're anything like me, you'll get an appeal at least once a day. You know, I think the major effect of nonprofit organizations in the United States is the death of trees. This is personally how I look at it. You know, the major effect is the death of trees. But they get so many appeals, and I know people who every time they get an appeal send $1 to each one, and you have no idea what you're involved in. It's better to find something that you really are about and support it as an organization. Some people get no personal satisfaction out of giving to an organization. And I'd remind you, this is about the cheerfulness, how you enjoy it. Sometimes it's much better to give to an individual. And so they're hungry people on the street that you can give money to, or you can give money to Dorothy's, and probably they're feeding those same people. So, I mean, you could do it either way. And I always cite the example here of Michael Miller. When I was in, he was a member of our Jesu Caritas group for a while. And one of the things that we would oftentimes do is go to dinners in San Francisco. And when we as a group went to a dinner in San Francisco, we always allowed an extra hour to get from the hotel to the restaurant. Because Michael Miller, if someone comes up and asks for money on the street, will not give the person money. He takes them in a restaurant, buys a meal, and sits down with them until they eat it. Okay? And this is the way in which he, does that. So we would always understand that there was a good chance we were going to lose Mike between the hotel and the restaurant, and he would meet us at the restaurant once he finished this other thing. And it's because he got great personal satisfaction out of helping an individual and felt nothing out of sending money, to an organization. So it's a matter of finding out, that I think some people will look at certain things like they would help, that they'd like to help the really poor people, but they don't feel safe around them. Well, then an organization's the way to do it. If you just feel nothing with regards to the organization, but you do with people, then you help them with individuals. The thing is to do what you enjoy. The third thing has to do with projects. A lot of people like projects, and one of the reasons why they like projects is because projects oftentimes provide closure. Like, for instance, if you donate to a building, then there's a point at which the building is done. If you donate to the poor, remember, the poor you always have with you. We need to take care of the poor, but we will not solve the problem of poverty, okay? We need to take care of the sick. We will not end sickness, okay? And so sometimes what people need are these projects where you can actually see something finished, a building or something like that. And sometimes projects are connected with causes. A project might be cancer. It might be, when I was a youngster, I guess as an example, I think you know I had polio. And when I was in the hospital with polio, I even forget the name of the organization at the time that dealt with polio, but they supported a percentage of my hospitalization. And so my parents were very involved with that kind of raising funds for the rest of their lives. And it was interesting to me that immediately after the Salk vaccine came out, the donations to that community for fighting polio tripled that year. And it's because of this sense of accomplishment. My God, we got rid of polio. Now what do we do? And so as an organization, I think they're involved today in childhood diseases or something like that. But as an organization, they still go on fighting in certain things. But to the degree you can actually conquer something like that, people become very, very enthusiastic. But you can do things like veterans and stuff like that. Oftentimes, people become very, very attached to certain causes and feel very strongly about them, and that's good. I think it's also good when these causes that raise money do things people like marathons and stuff like that, and things that involve people. The next thing has to do with when to give alms. And I guess the first thing in the Jewish tradition is the giving of alms was to be consistent, okay? So they would find a way to consistently support something. And when I think of the consistency of support, I'm always reminded of a set scene in Fiddler on the Roof. And I don't know if any of you remember it, but it sounds funny, but it is in fact a very Jewish approach to almsgiving, where Entevi's on his way home, and he passes this beggar on the street, and he hands the beggar a kopeck. And the beggar looks at him and he says, "You usually give me 2 kopecks. And Entevi says, "I've had a difficult week." And he says, "You've had a difficult week, so why should I suffer?" And the idea is that that's his consistent thing. He gives 2 kopecks to this man, and it's expected. That is the way it's done. So in the Jewish tradition, almsgiving, first of all, takes this thing of consistency. And one of the things that my grandfather told me when I was a youngster, he says that if you are consistent in the idea of giving alms, you never have a sense of giving. You know, it's one of the things you do as part of the giving, and so it just goes. You don't have this sense of it. I've told you the story of my grandfather as a result. When my grandfather was a gambler and a boxing manager, and had immense amounts of money periodically. And as a result, he was, I think largely my family from the Presbyterian background held the tithing thing. So my grandfather was locked into this tithing. But one time he had a large block of money, and what he used to do was put aside what he was going to do as his tithe, and would pray to God about where it was to go. And he would donate it to different things at different times. But it was this consistent, tithe that he would put aside. And after a rather large win, he prayed about where it was supposed to go. And the Lord indicated to him it was to go to the Propagation of the Faith. And he went downtown San Diego to the office of the Propagation of the Faith. The man who was head of the Propagation of the Faith was a brand new priest who came over from Ireland, William Bergen. And being the new priest in the diocese, he got the worst job, which was raising money during the Depression. So this is his job. So he was sitting at his desk. He later told me that he was praying about what could be done because of the difficulties he was in. And when my grandfather came in his office, the guy was so involved in prayer that my grandfather didn't want to disturb him and just put the check on the desk. And the check, I think, was for about $200, which at that time would actually buy a house. And so later, when I was entering the seminary and took the test to go in the seminary, my name was too far down on the list in the grading of the test to actually enter the seminary because of the dyslexia. I had all these problems. But the rector of the seminary at that point was Monsignor Bergen, who looked down the list and recognized the name from the check. Okay? All pastors do. And so he recognized this name from the check. And that's how I got to the seminary. But my grandfather consistently would, give the money, but he would give it at set points. They separated it from his money so that it was a consistent thing. And the other thing is, in particular, needs awareness. I think one of the interesting things about Americans is we are probably the most generous people in the entire world when a specific need is made known. Like when we see, and I think that's one of the great benefits of news and TV. There are horrible, things that you and I all know about the media, all this sort of thing. But there is a remarkable thing about being able to look at the TV and see what happened in Japan and to know the real need and ways to deal with it. And Americans respond very well to that. And some people find a great satisfaction in meeting this kind of a need. I also think one of the best ways to give alms is to people who share the same type of work that you're involved in. Like, for instance, if you happen to be a teacher or a student, sometimes the most enjoyable way to give money is to support the schools or to support teachers' organizations, either in this country or some country in need or something like that. But to always look around for something that will make you, enjoy the giving. So having put all this together, what are we talking about? I'll go back to the Jewish thing. First of all, our support of the tithe, which is support of the poor, I believe is handled by taxes. The next thing about the temple tax, each one of us needs to be involved in some support of the parish, whatever we feel to be involved in the parish. Then after that, we're talking this almsgiving. And in almsgiving, it's a matter of never doing anything that you don't enjoy, and to try and find areas that make it easy for you to give and areas where you enjoy, and never go beyond what you can give with a smile. If you can't smile while you're giving it, don't give it. And the other thing is to understand that today we see donations much more like the Jews did. If you were to go back probably 200 years, you would find out that the really big thing of giving and has to do with this, time and talent. The treasure is money, but it has to do with time and talent. And that I think one of the sad things today is that oftentimes it's very difficult for people to give talent to a parish. I don't know whether you're aware of this side of it, but we oftentimes have people volunteering to do something in the parish that a lawyer will not let us have them do, okay? That you can't allow them to go so high on ladders, you can't allow them to do this, you can't allow them to do the other thing. And so there's a lot of the talent thing that it is very, very difficult to share in giving today, but to the degree you're able to do it, that's, I think, a very important thing. I remember when the diocese was starting the Sarah Institute, probably about, maybe about 20 years ago. When they started the Sarah Institute, one of the things they were doing was having a rummage sale as far as raising money. And so I volunteered. I was pastor in San Luis, so I volunteered to come up and help them set up tables and set up the whole rummage thing. And I got a letter from the woman who was in charge of the sale. And she says, your time would be much better put into the silk screens you're doing. Why don't you create a print? Do it for us. and we'll sell it at the thing. So that's what I did. But she said flat out, your talent is better than moving tables. We don't need you to move tables. So I think a person oftentimes needs to be aware of the talent they can bring to community. And some people find a lot more, again, happiness in sharing that. I'm sure that like the people who are involved in the decorations for Easter and that sort of thing, the great satisfaction is to be able to walk in that door and see the decorations. That is the satisfaction. Then that's a wonderful way to give alms in time and in talent. This incidentally is called stewardship. To understand that the time you have, the talents you have, these are all gifts from God. And one day before God, you and I will be able to enjoy in His presence the real benefits of how we have used those things. Okay. Any questions?